Hello and welcome to another episode of Study Sessions. Today we're looking very specifically at stave 3 of Dickens's A Christmas Carol. The focus is on stave 3, and particularly the focus will be today on the scene where the ghost of Christmas present takes Scrooge through the humble Cratchit household on Christmas Day. Now, in this particular stave, what Dickens is doing is humanising the poor. He lovingly details the Cratchit family's warmth, their resilience, and that's in stark contrast to Scrooge's earlier cold, utilitarian, and rather Malthusian view of poverty. Now, remember that in stave 1, Scrooge had callously told charity collectors that if the destitute, the very, very poor, would rather die, they should, and this is a crucial quotation, decrease the surplus population. Now, we know that this is a remark that echoes Malthusian ideas, then popular in Victorian England. What Dickens does in stave 3 is directly challenge this harsh and, many would argue, inhumane view through some very vivid imagery and also through some dialogue. So as we see, Tiny Tim and the Cratchits are given a kind of rich, detailed and rather sentimental focus, and that's designed to elicit our sympathy as readers, but also to critique the brutal economic calculus of social theories like utilitarianism and the ideas of Thomas Malthus. So in stave 3, thinking about that idea of warmth in poverty, to go back to some of my earlier episodes on the language of temperature and the role of setting in shaping our understanding of character, remember in stave 3, the ghost of Christmas present, a ghost that radiates abundance and goodwill, shows Scrooge a range of different Christmas scenes. He enters Bob Cratchit's very modest home, and the ghost smiled and stopped to bless the dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Now, Dickens immediately emphasises the family's value. Despite Bob having but 15 bob a week in wages, the generous spirit still blesses their humble home. This detail, the 15 shillings a week, reminds us how poor Cratchit is, and yet Dickens treats the home as worthy of a kind of divine blessing. Even Scrooge, the greatest miser of all, must witness that simple households like this deserve grace, deserve a blessing. Now, Mrs. Cratchit and her children are bustling about, preparing the Christmas meal, and they do so with pride and really obvious joy. Dickens describes Mrs. Cratchit in her twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons. Her dress is old, it's patched, but she's taking the time and the care and the effort to adorn it with bright ribbons. It's only sixpence worth of decoration, showing that the dignity of the poor and her understanding and recognition of a sense of occasion. We have that image too of young Peter Cratchit standing by the hearth in his father's enormous shirt with the monstrous shirt collar. Even the children are brimming with excitement. The two youngest are racing around screaming. They've smelt the goose, they've known it for their own. They're dancing about the table in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. In Dickens's narrative, we practically feel their anticipation, the hot potatoes bubbling away in the saucepan and the goose roasting in the oven. All of this sense of excitement is extremely poignant and emotionally engaging. It is building, I suppose, the emotional stakes that are going to make the potential death of Tiny Tim all the more rich in pathos. Now, when the dinner is finally served, Dickens draws out the joy and the suspense of the moment. Mrs. Cratchit carves the goose. There is the long-expected gush of stuffing. There's a murmur of delight from the family. And Tiny Tim himself is beating the table with his knife handle and faintly crying out, "Hurrah!" Every single detail from Dickens in the delicious feast that has been eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, the fact that everyone has had enough and the children have been steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, every detail conveys warmth, abundance, and plenty. It's a description of a meal that shows that despite their poverty, the Cratchits experience true Christmas abundance, but it's an abundance of love and food, however modest. Mrs. Cratchit's pride in her cooking is really moving and delightful. The family beams at the slightly cracked brandy-flamed pudding, a wonderful pudding that Bob jokingly calls the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. After the feast, the Cratchits gather around the hearth, that symbol of human connection, family, love, kindness, togetherness, and they toast each other. Bob Cratchit raises, if you remember, a modest cup of the hot stuff from the jug, and with beaming looks proposes a Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, God bless us. Of course, the family echoes that blessing, as does Tiny Tim, small, frail, weak Tiny Tim, who cheers, God bless us, everyone. This simple line, uttered with, quote, a feeble little voice by Tim, is the, in many ways, emotional climax of the scene. It captures their generosity, their inclusive love. Dickens's choice of words is plain but very powerful here. The family, they're pretty much starving, they're cramped in this small house, offers a universal blessing. It's an image that humanizes the poor, showing them as kind, grateful, full of love. They aren't burdens on society or a group that needs to be criminalized and imprisoned, and they're certainly not faceless, nameless statistics. Their dialogue and their actions, the affectionate kisses between Mrs. Cratchit, and Martha, all of this kind of teasing delight over the pudding, Tiny Tim's cheerful exclamation, all of it reinforces their humanity and strength of Christmas spirit. Dickens makes us as readers feel for these people. They're not disposable surplus lives, they're writ in heart and they're absolutely worthy of care. Now, central to the Cratchits' human story is, as I've already mentioned, that figure of Tiny Tim. Dickens describes Tim poignantly throughout. When Bob Cratchit comes home from church, the text notes, "Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame." This imagery, the withered hand, the brace on his legs, immediately evokes fragility and innocence. Tiny Tim is only a small child, obviously tiny because of his size, and yet he has this calm, joyous soul. His gentle "God bless us everyone" is all the more affecting emotionally because we sense how weak he is. Dickens deliberately makes Tim a figure of pathos. He is joyful despite his feebleness, and he represents what is at stake when society neglects the poor. The ghost of Christmas Present makes the danger to Tiny Tim explicit. When Scrooge asks, "Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live," the spirit shows Scrooge a vision. "I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." The imagery here is very, very stark. Tim's empty chair, the abandoned crutch, and this moment is heartbreaking. Tiny Tim, who only wants to bless everyone, now faces the threat of death. The spirit's words literally echo that Malthusian logic. Immediately following, the ghost repeats Scrooge's earlier phrase. These words come from Scrooge's mouth originally. "If you be like to die, you'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population." By having the ghost voice Scrooge's callous line back at him in the context now of Tiny Tim, Dickens heightens the horror of poverty, the horror of the consequences of poverty. Scrooge himself in this moment is overcome with penitence and grief upon hearing his own words used about this innocent boy. Tiny Tim thus embodies all the victims of cold economic theory. Dickens endows Tiny Tim with holiness and goodness. He's gentle, patient, thankful. His character is marked by piety and humour despite his suffering. When the ghost rebukes Scrooge further, he asks, "Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die?" and points out that in heaven's eyes, Scrooge might be more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Now, this is a really dramatic line, and I think you can really hear Dickens's voice emerging in the text, that social commentary coming through loud and clear. Tiny Tim is explicitly invoked as a yardstick, a measure of human value, and it shows how vehemently Dickens rejects the idea of a surplus population. The spirit compares Scrooge's stance to an insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust. This is very powerful figurative language, showing how absurd and cruel it is for any healthy or wealthy and successful person to judge another human, especially a disabled child, and certainly to suggest that that disabled child is expendable. So by focusing on Tiny Tim's potential possible death if Scrooge doesn't change, Dickens makes that abstract economic debate concrete and moral. We're not just debating numbers here. We're talking about a frail child suffering, and we feel Bob Cratchit's anguished, poor fellow reaction when Tiny Tim falters on the walk home. That famous line, "God bless us everyone," becomes a rallying cry. It contrasts sharply with that horrible, inhumane Malthusian idea of decrease the surplus population. Dickens wants us to remember Tiny Tim's face, his fragile little body, when we hear Dickens pronouncing about that decrease of the surplus population. The emotional weight of Tim's fragility and goodness forces Scrooge and the reader to humanise the poor. Now, to fully appreciate Dickens's message, we do need a little bit of historical context. By the 1840s, thinkers like Thomas Malthus had made theories of population really popular in England. In 1798, Malthus had argued that population tends to grow faster than food supply, so unchecked growth in population leads to overpopulation and scarcity. These ideas actually influenced public policy and, crucially, attitudes towards the poor and poverty itself. Now, Dickens himself loathed the ideas of Malthus. Malthus, in some senses, was one of his great enemies. Scrooge's line about the poor dying is therefore no offhand insult. It is echoing the era's dominant economic thought. At the time, Victorian political economists often treated the poor as numbers. In a sort of cold utilitarian calculus, Tiny Tim is a member of the surplus population. Dickens sets A Christmas Carol against the tide of that cold logic. It's a critique of that kind of logic and way of thinking about the poor and poverty. The Ghost of Christmas Present carries a torch shaped like, remember, a cornucopia or Plenty's horn, sitting on that throne of food. He symbolises abundance and generosity. Through these visions, Dickens shows human prosperity, bustling markets, happy poor people in the streets, instead of inevitable scarcity. Even more pointedly, he contrasts Scrooge's cruel question, "Are there no prisons? Are the union workhouses still in operation?" And of course, the decrease of surplus population. He contrasts all of that with the Cratchits' joyful, human Christmas. So in Stave 3, Dickens gives voice to that moral critique through the Ghost of Christmas Present. Remember, when he does mention, Scrooge mentions decrease of surplus population, that same phrase stings him again. It returns to haunt him, if you will, coming from the spirit, in Stave 3. But this time he's kind of ironically using it, aiming it at Tiny Tim. The narrative's dialogue and tone makes that critique clear. Dickens is satirizing and critiquing the idea that some people are somehow a surplus. If man you be in heart not adamant, will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? Dickens is showing us that utilitarian, Malthusian logic collapsing under its own brutality. Wealthy men like Scrooge sit at their desks, miles away from hardship, and yet they have the arrogance and the hubris to pronounce on life and death for others. So Dickens incorporates the Cratchits' own dialogue too, to critique that worldview. Don't forget, when Bob calls Ebenezer Scrooge the founder of the feast, Mrs. Cratchit, I'm on team Mrs. Cratchit angrily retorts that she wishes she could give Scrooge a piece of my mind to feast upon. He's odious, he's stingy, he's unfeeling, as she terms him. The poor Cratchits, certainly Mrs. Cratchit, recognise the injustice of Scrooge's attitude. Yes, they've got Christmas spirit, but her words reveal outrage at Scrooge's miserly meanness and misanthropy. It's the voice of ordinary people condemning the indifference and the cruelty of the elite. So in short then, Stave 3 challenges, critiques and satirises Malthusian economics. It challenges those ideas about poverty. The cheerful abundance around the Cratchits and the injustice of Tiny Tim's fate function as a direct counter-argument to the idea that the poor are somehow expendable. He, in a sense, as an author, Dickens is dramatising an alternative moral economy, one in which compassion, family and faith are more valuable than cold calculations related to profit and wealth. By vividly portraying poor characters, by showing us poverty with a human face, having them speak with dignity and humour, he's insisting as an author that every child, every man has intrinsic worth beyond their mere basic economic value. So he humanises the poor. He shows us poverty with a human face through the Cratchit family. And the message is clear then. Love, family, human dignity matter more than any economic theory. Tiny Tim's hopeful blessing at the end of the Cratchit meal and Scrooge's shock at the consequences of neglecting Bob Cratchit, exploiting Bob Cratchit, neglecting Tiny Tim, leaves us with a powerful moral lesson. Dickens is implying, of course, that every one of us is worth life and compassion. This is the heart of Stave 3, a lesson Dickens hoped would enkindle charity in his readers and lay to rest the ghost of heartless social theories.